No? Okay, good. So really, given the structure, it occurred to me last night, given the structure of the current situation, if you're going to bring something that's deeply relevant to the current situation, it would be the Jewish experience in Europe. It would be not really actually the Slavic experience in Europe. The Slavs, Ukrainians were considered in Nazi ideology as natural slaves, like Africans were considered under imperialism and slavery. That's why Hitler took 2 million Ukrainians into slave labor. Some Ukrainian nationalists thought that Hitler would be an ally against the Soviet Union. That was an error. But currently, it's different. Currently, it's more like Jewish people. It's more like the Nazi ideology about Jews was Jews were the mortal enemy of Aryans. And so they needed to all be killed. There could be no Jews because Jews, and everybody else was inferior. But Jews weren't really inferior. Jews were more like, the devil. Jews were there in order to to eliminate Aryans. And so for Aryans to survive, you must kill the Jews. And that's more structurally analogous to what Ukrainians face. The Russian ideology about Ukraine is that Ukrainian identity is just anti-Russian. The Ukrainians are just there to be anti-Russian. And so as long as there are Ukrainians, Russians face an existential threat. And that's what the Nazis thought about the Jews. So when I devised this course, I was thinking more about what the Nazis thought about Ukrainians. The Nazis thought that Ukrainians were natural slaves, and they would grab Ukraine, take the food, and enslave the Ukrainians, exactly as Black Americans were enslaved, Black Africans were enslaved. That's what Hitler did. He wanted to take the land because Ukrainians, according to the ideology of Hitler, were savages, and then he wanted to enslave the Ukrainians. But right now, you guys are Jews. Your very existence is incompatible with Russian existence. And that's exactly what the Nazis thought about the Jews. So it's really it's really European anti-Semitism that we need to also be discussing European anti-Semitism. So I will think about that and how to, because you need to think about what it means to be thought of that way. But we're still talking, but we're talking about European colonialism in this class. And European colonialism, this is the ideology that Hitler directed. I thought you guys would be more mad at Hitler than you are. But this is the ideology that Hitler directed against Ukraine. Hitler was like, we lost our African colonies, let's just do that in Ukraine, and we'll take their grain, and we'll have big farms, plantations, and Ukrainians will work the plantations, and it will be great. The Americans showed us how you could do that. Okay. And I've recognized through my discussion with many Ukrainians, it's thrown me off a little, because when I hear European values, I hear racism. Like, we want to be European, we want to be racist. So it sounds different to me. So I thought I want to think about that coming out of Cesare. And I want to think about how our attitude towards, want to think about our attitude towards European liberalism. I want to think about, this theoretical question that Lem raised and also Julia raised about what do we think about the language, vocabulary, and concepts of human rights when those vocabulary and concepts are so intermingled with colonialism and racism. Is Lem still here? No. So, 'cause Right. So Julia was like, nationalisms violate human rights. And so what do you do in those situations? And that's very important. We have to, and my reaction was sometimes the language of human rights, the concepts, are used for colonial domination. Like, we're going to bring freedom, liberty, and democracy to you, and really, you're just going to take their land. And, but Lem said, isn't this like Marx, which around here is like, that means, isn't this bad? And so Lem was saying, Cesare is criticizing bourgeois morality. We know that move, and we're for bourgeois morality. Now, and yes, Cesare is criticizing, the concepts of the Enlightenment. But the thing to do in response to that, if you want to defend those concepts, is to say, well, you're really appealing to those concepts even in your critique of them. So when Cesare talks about the correct attitude, and Cesare is not Marx, right? Because Cesare is not saying we should all just be identical and have our class interests. Cesare is saying, no, we should have differences, and everybody has their own language and nationality. And what he says is, and that's what's important for him, that you respect differences, and but that's tolerance, right? That's the liberal value of tolerance. In his discussion of civilizations, when he talks about the difference between colonialism and civilizations meeting each other, he says, his discussion of the good things. Civilizations interacting each other is a good thing. That's liberal tolerance. So that's the kind of critique, that's the kind of reaction to, that's my reaction as a liberal. I know that being a liberal is, in the tradition I'm in, the black intellectual tradition, it's not a great thing to be a liberal, and I don't freely admit that, but I'm admitting it to you since you won't tell anyone. And so I think it's very hard to escape the liberal concepts. And you think you see even in Cesare, as he's criticizing the concepts of liberalism, he's appealing to those concepts. He's saying, yeah, we should all be tolerant of each other. Civilizations should meet as equals. Okay, so the theme of today is going to be that racism is a central European value. And I'm going to talk about, I'm going to continue talking about Cesare. I should have assigned Charles Mills's The Racial Contract. That was a mistake, but I'll do a little reading from it. I strongly recommend that book, The Racial Contract. I also should have signed Eric Williams' Slavery and Capitalism. But we'll be discussing, today I'm going to discuss chapter 6. So part 2 of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism is called Imperialism. So, and really this book is about Nazism. It isn't about Stalin at all. It's about Nazism. And she recognized very clearly what only black intellectuals recognized at the time, which is that Nazism, this whole book is about how Nazism naturally fits into the European tradition. It's like something you should have expected, which is Cesare. So, you have Cesare, Du Bois, but you also have Arendt, who is white, which is really radical. Notice, she's Jewish, so that might be part of it, but it's very hard. There are not that many men who are famous feminists, right? But Arendt gives a very detailed description in this book of the centrality of racism to European identity. the chapter we're going to read, we're going to discuss today, Race Thinking Before Racism, looks at different racial constructs emerging from Western European nationalism. So Arendt is saying there's different kinds of racism. There's the kind of racism you get with British colonialism, the kind of French racism, and there's kind of German racism. And they're different. Each of them are different and related to the national identities, but each of them justified versions of colonialism. So let me begin with, chapter 2 of Charles Mills's The Racial Contract. So where in this chapter, he looks at, the main theorists of the social contract, of the liberal tradition. So the first social contract theorist is, so the social contract is a central concept in political philosophy, that societies should be organized around a kind of social contract where we all agree that we're going to live in society together and we're going to obey the same rules because it will protect us from the savagery of living up alone and apart. So Hobbes is the first social contract theorist, but Hobbes is not a Democrat. Hobbes thinks we agree to take a ruler. But the rest of the social contract theorists in the liberal tradition are not authoritarians. So Rousseau is obviously the first modern democratic theorist, and Kant is the sort of main liberal theorist. So in chapter 2 of The Racial Contract, Mills tells you what these theorists thought about black people and indigenous Americans. This is the liberal tradition. By the way, Rousseau in the social code, what do you think Rousseau thought about women? Same, yeah. Rousseau was a Emile, who's a boy, gets this big education, and the last chapter and the first 4 or 5 chapters of Emile, I think 5 chapters, are about how Emile is educated to not have amour propre and enter civil society. And the final chapter is called Sophie. And it's about the education of women, how you educate women to be subordinate to men. And so this is Mr. Equality. So for gender, and Charles Mills's The Racial Contract is meant to echo Carol Pateman's The Sexual Contract, which makes many of the same points about gender, that many liberal theorists, that all the liberal theorists were sexists, who promoted equality, but they themselves didn't somehow see that the equality they promoted was just for men. So let me read you some Rousseau and Kant. Hold on. Oh, wait. I'm not here we are, chapter 2. Sorry. This is a dramatic pause. Right. So Rousseau, as you probably know, has this notion of the noble savage, and the noble savage is, truly free, and then, we have to replicate that kind of freedom we have to somehow so Rousseau is giving a sort of a religious story of the noble savage is free. It's like in Eden, and then we fall from freedom, and we're in civil society, and we have to figure out how to regain a kind of freedom inside civil society. That's Rousseau. So the noble savage is not a bad fellow in Rousseau. The noble savage is okay, but so this is Charles Mills. But a careful reading of the text reveals, once again, crucial racial distinctions. The only natural savages cited are non-white savages, examples of European savages being restricted to reports of feral children raised by wolves and bears. Child-rearing practices, we are told by Rousseau, comparable to those of Hottentots and Caribs. Europeans are so intrinsically civilized that it takes upbringing by animals to turn them into savages. For Europe, savagery is in the dim, distant past. And Rousseau writes, one of the best reasons why Europe, if not the earliest to be civilized, has been at least more continuously and better civilized than the other parts of the world, is perhaps that it is at once the richest in iron and most fertile in wheat, unquote. So that's just not true. As Franz Boas says in his 1906, gives a lecture in 1906 to in Atlanta University, a black university, and points out that every African village has an iron worker, has an ironsmith. Right. Moreover, to make the obvious point, even if some of Rousseau's non-white savages are noble, they are primitive beings who are not actually part of civil society, barely above animals without language. Now Kant. Surely Kant is better. Oh, right. We forgot Locke, another major liberal theorist. Locke argues that God gave the world, quote, to the use of the industrious and rational, unquote, which qualities were indicated by labor. So while industrious and rational Englishmen were toiling away at home, in America, by contrast, one found, a quote, wild woods and uncultivated waste left to nature, unquote, by the lazy Indians. Though they share the state of nature for a time with non-whites, then their residence is necessarily briefer, since whites, by appropriating and adding value to this natural world, exhibit their superior rationality. Locke thinks if you mix your labor with something, you own it. But somehow Native Americans never get to own any property because they're lazy, and so they've never mixed their labor with something. This, by the way, laziness, whenever you want to oppress a group, you say they're lazy. The Nazis also said Jews were lazy. Right. So Locke's thesis that, laboring on a land made it yours was like the basis for seizing land from the indigenous population of America, because the idea was they were lazy and didn't use it. So Locke had investments in the slave trading Royal Africa Company and had assisted in writing the slave Constitution of Carolina. So one of the main liberal theorists helped write the Constitution for a slave state. So then Rousseau, we've done. What about Kant? Surely Kant isn't a racist. He's a good guy. He's Kant, right? We're all possessed of reason. So let's see. And Kant is the most important. Isn't Kant the most important? Anyone who's been in a philosophy department in America, like, oh God, Kant. It's like you can't say anything bad about Kant. And for years, Mills couldn't get a job in a better department because of the things he said about Kant. And then towards the end of his life, we made him an offer at Yale, and finally people were like, okay. So here's Kant on race. So fundamental is the difference between the black and white races of man, it appears to be as great in regards to the mental capacities as in color. So Kant is saying that the difference between white people and black people is as large in color, is as large as their difference in mental capacities. A clear proof that what a Negro said was stupid was that this fellow was quite black. Kant demarcates and theorizes a color-coded racial hierarchy of Europeans, Asians, Africans, and Native Americans, differentiated by their degree of innate talent. Talent is that which by nature guarantees for the white, in Kant's racial, rational, and moral order, the highest position above all creatures. And then Kant gives a listing of races. It's whites, then yellow, then black, then red. So Asians are second, black people are third, and indigenous Americans are last. It cannot be argued that skin color, from here he's quoting another theorist, it cannot be argued that skin color for Kant was merely a physical characteristic. It is rather evidence of an unchanging and unchangeable moral quality. Kant says that Asians lack the ability to develop abstract concepts. The innately lazy Africans can at least be educated to be servants and slaves. Kant gives advice on how to beat black people efficiently. And the wretched Native Americans are just hopeless and can never be educated at all. So they just need to be exterminated. So that's Europe. You know, the European liberal tradition is the European racist tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't save the concepts of liberalism. And in fact, Charles Mills, in his final book, before he tragically died early, he's a wonderful person. I mean, go to the doctor. He never went to the doctor, and he was just like, oh, I feel more and more sick, and then he had advanced cancer because he didn't go to the doctor. So it was horrible. He was a wonderful person. But anyway, that doesn't have anything to do with the topics of this class. Mills himself, in his last work, defends a thesis he calls, in the book is called black-white rights and white wrongs, something like that. And he defends a view he calls black radical liberalism. So he does become a liberal for the same reason I said, because he thinks any critique of liberalism must appeal to liberal concepts. So that's, you know, if you're criticizing liberalism, you're going to be criticizing it from the perspective of liberal concepts, because we don't have any other concepts other than transparency, openness, tolerance, etc. Now, some people challenge that. The young political theorist Adam Getachew, who I've mentioned before, argues that, for instance, Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, didn't simply take French concepts. So there's a kind of black radical liberalism sort of takes what that does is it says the problem with the liberal concept, the problem Europeans had was that they only applied the liberal concepts to white guys. But you really had to apply the liberal concepts to everyone. And so that was the error. But Adam Getachew argues that, I think I'm pronouncing her name wrong, she's at the University of Chicago, political science. She argues that this was not what, so there's a picture of the Haitian Revolution. So the Haitian Revolution is the only successful slave revolution in history. And they've been paying for it ever since, right? You know, they had to give reparations to France, billions of dollars in reparations to France for the lost property, meaning themselves. And then the world has been punishing Haiti ever since. But Toussaint Louverture, the political leader of the Haitian rebellion, Getachew argues that, so the standard theory is they were influenced by the French, and they were like, okay, liberty, that's a great concept, we want that too, so you just have to expand it. And Getachew argues that that's not what's going on, that in fact Toussaint Louverture had new concepts that guided him, and was not simply borrowing from the European concepts of liberty and equality and brotherhood. So this question, so yes, when you talk about Europe and Arendt, we're going to go through Arendt, and Arendt is very, very, is really good on this because she has this kind of detailed analysis of the different forms of European racism that underlie colonialism. But when you're talking about European values, you have to, to omit racism is to be completely ahistorical. And I'll inject a personal comment here. My father, who was a Holocaust survivor, was 7 when he left Berlin, so he didn't experience a death camp, but he experienced Kristallnacht. So he wrote his dissertation on British colonialism in Kenya, and he spent 3 years in Kenya. And I always, when I was younger, I would wonder, why did a Holocaust survivor spend so much time? Because I knew my dad talked about the Nazis all the time. In the last 6 months of his life, every day he would watch a movie about the defeat of the Nazis because it made him feel safe. It was like he wanted to watch the Nazis lose again and again and again. And but he wrote his dissertation on British colonialism. And so when I was younger, I would wonder why, but now I understand, because he understood that colonialism underlies Nazism. And of course, we had this family story that I grew up with where he was attacked by a flying cockroach in Kenya, and he killed it with his copy of Hannah Arendt, Origins of Totalitarianism. So he was bringing this book into the bush in Kenya. So obviously he was guided by part 2 of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. So, and Arendt notices, she's the only white theorist of the mid-20th century who notices, it's obvious, it's completely obvious that Nazism is racism, right? But she notices that this is a European project, that it's not Nazism is not some strange thing. It comes from colonialism, from African colonialism, which is, of course, what Cesare says. And Du Bois, as we'll read later, says that everybody, Du Bois, Cesare, Fanon, this is kind of obvious to them. But Arendt is very clear about this as well. Now, it's for a long time until the current moment, when it's quite obvious that there are non-whites and non-white countries that are very successful and dominant. Europe sort of had a kind of hegemony, and the question is why. So in the tradition in which I'm sort of influenced by, here's what I believe, which is sort of the main thesis of the Black intellectual tradition. Eric Williams's book, Slavery and Capitalism, is a classic reference here, but there's an enormous literature on this. Why does Europe gain hegemony? Because of colonialism. Because it rapes and pillages Africa, the United States, and gains immense wealth. So Eric Williams argues that it's because of slavery that the Industrial Revolution that you have the Industrial Revolution. Of course, when we look at the ancient world, we can obviously see that political success of empires is based on colonialism. Athens and Sparta are colonial empires that gain their wealth by colonialism. This is an ancient point. The topic, we begin with Thucydides to show that the connection between colonialism, success, and wealth is not some new thing. The trick that Europeans pulled off was racism, right? That's the added European move. We talked about, Sergei raised the fact that there's obviously Asian imperialism. There's obviously imperialisms. There was Greek imperialism. The Spartans were not enslaving, and the Athenians were not enslaving non-Greeks. They were enslaving other Greeks. They were dominating other Greeks. So it's not like colonialism is limited to a to a particular group. And as Sergey and I were both discussing with different examples, savage versions of imperialism have occurred between people of the same race. Just think Japan's most obvious 20th century example is Japan's occupation of China. Think of the rape of Nanking, which is kind of like Baba Yar in its horrors. Like 130,000 people, the Japanese army kills 130,000 people in a few days, in the most savage ways imaginable. So, of course, you can have just as vicious colonialism and imperialism between people of the same race. And it's an important point to mention and emphasize, because in the Black intellectual tradition, by some of the great theorists, they missed this. So Du Bois made the error, though he realized it later, of overlooking the brutality of the Japanese occupation of China, because he thought, he was thinking along these lines that colonialism really becomes brutal when it's racial domination. But European colonialism justifies itself by racial domination. And Hitler's move was to racialize Europeans, to say that Slavs were like black people. And in particular, the group that he took specifically to be like black people were Ukrainians. That's why as soon as he moved in, he just created slave labor immediately. So this construction, this construct of, it's literally, Hitler takes it, he takes it both from African colonialism, but the example he gives, as I've emphasized several times, is American slavery, which of course is racialized. Okay, right. So Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, he's saying slavery is why you have the European Industrial Revolution, and it's colonialism that leads to European domination. Like it was colonialism that led to Athenian domination and Spartan domination and the Persian Empire. It's not a new story. It's just the difference is race. Before we turn to Arendt, so questions or comments on that first part? You guys look sleepy and tired. What's your name? What? Mordana? No, sorry. Okay, sorry. Sorry, go on. Do we have a microphone? Okay. Wait for the microphone, because I'm pretty much deaf.
I have a brief comment to what you said in the very beginning about that you feel that Ukrainians don't dislike Hitler enough here.
Okay, it was a flippant comment.
I think it was a provocation, and probably Correct. You succeeded, because I was thinking about it for, 20 minutes.
Okay.
And I just want to bring some light to this point. I think that I need to say that, for example, my great-grandmother was Ostarbeiter. She was taken to Germany, and Exactly. Fortunately, she managed to come back to Ukraine. But here in Ukraine, the question of Hitler is a question of history, and Hitler didn't fortunately succeeded in what we wanted to do here. And also there was an international tribunal against Nazism. Of course, we may discuss a lot the question if the justice was served, because justice, I think, to my mind, wasn't served to anybody. But still, it was. And then Russian occupation power came here to Ukraine, and I think that for us, the question of Russia is much topical than the question of Hitler and Nazism, because Fortunately, question of Nazism is historical, and the question of Russia here is contemporary. Because, for example, today...
I'm going to disagree with you, but go on.
I will be very brief. Unfortunately, Russians do today what they did, for example, to my relatives 80 years ago or 90 years ago. So, for example, for my family and thousands of families, it is a very contemporary question. And also, I think that the big problem here in Ukraine, but also on a global scale, is that Russia somehow managed to become a main victim of Nazism. Of course, we are not, I'm not speaking here about Holocaust, but I mean that Russia sacrificed so much to win this war, I mean
Right.
the Second World War, and then they made the victory in this war the Russian victory. And of course, you definitely know better than me how Timothy Snyder writes how many Ukrainians were part of the Red Army, and that all the war struggle mainly was on our land. But it is omitted still in the public history and in public discourse, and that's why this question is such important to Ukrainians, and maybe we don't dislike Hitler enough.
Right. Brilliant. But you also are walking right into the provocation. That's exactly what I wanted someone to say. So absolutely right. That's what I'm recognizing. However, here's my response. The Russians are Nazis now. They're not the Soviet Union. What you face is something like genocidal Nazism. And so it is Hitlerism that you face. It is that structure. It is not communism that you face, obviously. It's Russian ultranationalism, and what's happening to Ukraine is a kind of genocide based on your identity. So the ideology, an ideology something like Nazism, is the issue here. And as you helpfully said, so I don't have to say it, it's not true that the Russians were somehow specifically the targets of Nazism. In fact, the Ukrainians are mentioned. And who was the Red Army? The Red Army was Ukrainians, Russians, Georgians. It was everybody. It was all the Slavs together. It was the Slavs that Hitler aimed at, and it was the Ukrainians, and Ukrainians suffered just as much as anyone. So Russians are absolutely wrong that this story that the Russians tell themselves is absolutely incorrect. But I also think it's somewhat incorrect to say that the Soviet Union was a Russian occupation of Ukraine. There were plenty of Ukrainians who were committed that same point, that Ukrainians were central to the Red Army. It's also true Ukrainians were central to the Soviet Union. Many Ukrainians were committed communists and part of this structure. So, you know, the Soviet Union was Ukraine, Russia, Georgia, a lot of this. It only later became a Russian-dominated enterprise. So, and the very point that the Red Army had Ukrainian commanders, Ukrainian generals, makes that point. That whole structure was the Soviet Union. Now I think, so it's what the Russians are saying is completely incorrect history. It's absolutely false. The Ukrainians, if anything, suffered the most from Nazis. Hitler mentions the Ukrainians specifically as the example Slavs that he's going to enslave. So that part is agreeing with me, but I think my view, and I talked to Alina about this on the car ride over, my view is what you face is something like Nazism from the Russians. And so, you know, sorry about the provocation. I knew I'd have to get some talking happening.
Yeah, actually, I have a short comment and a question to you. You are talking a question first. You are talking that Russians behave towards Ukraine like Nazis behaved towards Jews.
Right.
But don't you think they did this for decades? Like they did this to us also when we were part of the Soviet Union with those Holodomor, with the camps for Ukrainians, for Ukrainian intellectuals as well. And a short comment on occupation or union. Like Ukrainians were central people in the Red Army because we were forced to do this. That's why we, for example, explain to Europeans why they should help us, because otherwise we will become a part of Russia, and then we will become a part of Russian army to invade other European countries. They will use our human resource.
Like the Chechens.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple things before we, just a couple. I mean, I don't think it's fair to some of the great generals, Ukrainian generals of the Red Army, to say that they were somehow, I mean, you know, Ukrainian nationalists thought the Nazis would be their allies, and that was one of the great mistakes of the 20th century. So I think, you know, Ukrainians were squarely on the side, and should have been squarely on the side of the Red Army, because all Slavs were targeted by the Nazis. Timothy? Oh, wait, can we have the microphone over there?
I want to say that the moment we say that Ukrainians are excused from the horrors that the Soviet Union committed to Ukrainians, to other ethnicities, nationalities, to people around the world, in Afghanistan, in Hungary, we should say that Russians today are excused from what they are doing to us. Because there are so many Ukrainians who are able and willing to do things in the Communist Party, in KGB. I remember 90s and 2000, it was still considered to be prestigious to go and build a career in Moscow. In fact, there are many graduates of the Kiev School of Economics who build their careers in Moscow, and some remain in Russia today. And I can give many more examples that still people from the winners of the mathematical and physics and chemistry Olympiads in 2014, in 2016, 2018, they would still go to Moscow to study in Moscow State University, MFTI, and New Economic School, and build their careers from there. Some living to the US, but some staying in Russia. And some are serving in the government today. We have between 5 to 10 million Ukrainians today in Russia who have not come back and have not left Russia. So things are much more complex than saying Ukrainians were unwilling and Russians are willing. And we need to reflect seriously on collective responsibility of Russians in terms of what they are doing today to us, but also on our collective responsibility.
Yeah.
That what we have done to other people and to ourselves.
Yeah, when you talk about the Soviet Union, you're not talking about Russians. You're talking about different groups of people. You're certainly, and also, let's remember, the Soviet Union did defeat Nazi Germany, and it was Ukrainian generals and Ukrainian soldiers who fought in that, who were heroic in that battle, in those battles. It wasn't just Russians. Now, Ukrainian nationalists, some of them took the wrong side, but in the war in the Red Army, and that is a great, I don't think, it's the fake Russian history that says it was just the Russians who defeated the Nazis. It's fake Russian history. It was the Soviet Union who defeated the Nazis, and the Soviet Union included you guys. Wait, you had a question? What is your name again? Sophia. Sophia? Okay. I didn't think that this would raise any discussion.
Of course not. Sorry, what was your name? Timothy? Just sort of to piggyback on what
He's the president of the university, just in case.
Cool. To piggyback on what you said, if we're going to say that Ukrainians who fought for the Soviet Union were forced to do so, we're also going to have to excuse Russian conscripts right now, which I don't think we want to do. But then also just on the point...
Sophia works on the ethics of war.
And on the issue of Hitler, I've also been sort of surprised by Ukrainian attitudes. My family's from Ukraine, but I'm from the U.S. Ukrainian attitudes towards Hitler. I've specifically heard the phrase, in comparison to Stalin, Hitler was a little boy, and that is terrifying to me.
That's what I've experienced here too, which is, you know.
I think there's a big mistake happening, which is Hitler was actually very successful in Ukraine. The Holocaust, it's weird to say the Holocaust was successful here, but like...
No, it was completely successful.
The Holocaust was very successful here, and so the concept that Hitler didn't hurt Ukraine relies on the idea that Jews aren't Ukrainian, which is, I think, a mistake Ukrainians make a lot, but can be overcome easily.
Brilliant, Sophia, thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the mic. It's a great discussion I like and enjoy. And about this Hitler, Stalin or Hitler Russian thing, which is important to remember that Russia is doing now what it did for centuries. So we know we experienced Hitler for like 3 years or something, and we experienced...
he killed twice as many people
yeah.
as the Soviet Union killed.
We don't know, like, okay, I'm not talking about Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a successor of Russian Empire, and Russia is a successor of Russian Empire too. It considers itself. If we view it from that perspective, that's why I mean, like,
I mean, I do not think that that Ukraine was a passive victim
of course,
of the
I'm not saying
Union.
so.
It was part of the Soviet Union, and also it was part of its successes, defeating the Nazis.
Right. I'm absolutely
parts of its failure.
absolutely on your side in this. I'm not. I'm also about complexity. I'm not saying easy things and that everybody is bad besides us. But I mean, like, that's why it's just explaining the thing. Russia is not a Slavic country. In Russian Empire was not also a Slavic country because it subjugated so many nations who were not Slavic. And it did very bad things to them as well. And actually, what is happening now, they did to like 100 nations of Asians, Turks, and others. Like, you know, and it was real genocides, you know. And that they were experienced in making genocides. And it just was not so mediated as it is now.
Right. So Arendt is going to tell us that every European nation committed genocide.
Yeah. I'm not saying that they're the worst. I'm just explaining why, you know, Hitler is just one page of history, and we, of course, participating partly, and we have, you know, elites that were collaborating, and some people were choosing to work for imperial administration, but still, we experienced these hundreds of years of they were trying to eliminate the identity of Ukraine, and it's just now is being very mediated, and everybody sees that. But many of it was happening that nobody talks about, but because nobody cared, you know, as it was with Holodomor. It's just like one American journalist that made it public, but before that nobody cared because nobody knew. They were very good in media campaigning. So
right. Well, we're going to talk about because we didn't discuss the last chapter of Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost because it's not in your reading, unfortunately. It's called The Great Forgetting, and that's relevant for Holodomor. It's relevant for Babi Yar. It's relevant for Ukrainian nationalist crimes against Jews, which were also forgotten and not taught. So this issue of forgetting is something that, I mean, it's so shocking that the murder of 10 million Congolese was not something anyone knew about until the 1990s, you know. And Holodomor was something that was not a concept. And in fact, in the Eastern sphere for so long, the Holocaust was not a concept because the idea was just, you know, it was Eastern Europeans that were targeted. And so you didn't talk about how one group was almost entirely eliminated. Like Ukraine, the idea that Ukraine could be disconnected from Jews is incoherent because Jews were a national minority forever here and central to Ukrainian identity. Polish identity as well. So the Holocaust, Holodomor, European colonialism in Africa, American slavery, indigenous genocide in America. I bet also Israel will be doing this to Palestinians and is doing this to Palestinians. This kind of targeted forgetting. All of our groups of people have been subject to it. And all of the groups of people, and even when you try to not do targeted forgetting, and I will talk about this in more detail. But yeah, I mean, it's one of the great, the Congolese. I mean, I think we also, and this was, I think, Timothy's point, all of us have to remember, am I ever up here talking about how great the United States is? Do I do that? So if you're not also criticizing your country, you're not actually patriotic. So I am very into the United States, but being into the United States involves, talking about the fact that some of the worst genocides, human crimes in history were perpetrated by my country. Timothy, and then.
I want to say that we're building a better country. And to do that, we have to recognize what's not good right now and what has been bad, awful, tragic in the past. And we also need to understand the mechanisms that the structure that created the possibility where let's say, I was in politics, I was in the cabinet, I was in the 90s a businessman here when I was a kid, 16, 18 years old. So I know there is a dark side in me and there is a very human, good side in me. And I think that's true for me. I'm not trying to do some religion here. I'm just like, personally, my emotion could be extremely dark. I can dehumanize people. I have beaten up people like animals in my life. To protect myself or not, I tell myself stories. But I look in horror at my past. And I think we need to understand how we get to those stages. And I think it's very, I'm afraid, I'm scared when we start saying we're a great nation. We're just, because Russians are attacking us, it gives us a moral authority to say that, we have not done those, we don't have problems today. We do, everywhere in military, when we don't question military in terms of what they do. We don't question politicians or opposition today. When, we don't always say the truth. Or when we do, we start fighting and it becomes personal instead of constructive. I think it's also dangerous when politics become populistic and personality. We still don't have parties, ideological parties in Ukraine. We're 30 years into democracy and we still have personality politics. It's Poroshenko against Zelensky. It's not left versus right, it's not conservatives versus liberals. It's still one personality versus another personality. We have a long way to go to become a democracy. We have a lot of threats on the way. And it is important that only now I think we can at least start speaking in Ukraine. And still publicly we can't. If I go public with this discussion, I'll be attacked as non-patriot. And it will be a very toxic discussion. And there might even be consequences from the government. Someone will call me and ask me, I'll tell them to, take a walk, but still there would be some pressure. And I think that's not right. And I think we have to overcome it. So we have a very long way to go. But first we have to survive. And after that we have to build it. So I just don't accept this notion that somehow we're excused because we're being genocide or, Nazified, by Russians. We actually have to do more. But yeah.
Yeah. Look at what's happening. What happened with? I mean, you look at my people, Jewish people. I mean, I'm American. I'm American first, and everything else second. But I'm obviously American. But I have a baseball cap. But look at Jewish. If you ever want to see how victimhood doesn't help you, it can be problematic. Look at Israel. In Israel, they take the history of oppression, which was a real history of oppression, and use it to brutally subordinate the Palestinian people. So it's very tricky to identify yourself with victimhood because it can justify terrible treatment of other people. And this moment right now is a very precarious moment. I'm not speaking as the representative of a democracy. My country is about to elect a criminal far-right thug as its next president, you know, whose platform is racism and patriarchy. So, you know, I'm not speaking from a country that is a democracy. The United States has never been a democracy. It's been a racial hierarchy, an imperialist, racist enterprise. But you want to make it a democracy. That's the goal, and that's what Timothy is saying. All of our countries suck. We have to make them into democracies. That democracy is an ideal. What is your name again?
Olga.
Olga.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I'm totally supporting what Timothy says. My point was only to mention that those Ukrainians who stayed in Russia and also those Ukrainians who are fighting against Ukraine now in the Russian army, so I take those people as the people whose identity was erased completely. That was a fascist policy against Ukraine. That this is a result of the Russian fascist policy against Ukrainians. So they are kind of targets of these policies, and that's where Russia succeeded.
It's also how colonialism works. Colonialism always works by taking the colonized population, by, as Gugi Wathiongo is going to say, colonizing the mind. So creating the post-colonial elite, the people who are allied with the colonizing power and gain power and status by those alliances.
Yes, so, but I completely agree that there's no excuse. So we have to actively...
Well, it also fits into the colonial frame. I'm not talking about judgment as a philosopher. I'm like, oh, what theoretical frameworks? It fits into the frame. The Russians, you know, Fanon is going to talk about this. The colonized subject who goes to the capital. The person from Martinique who goes to Paris and then thinks of themselves as better because they have been to Paris. You know, so what Timothy is describing is exactly what Fanon is going to present us with. Fanon talks all the time in Black Skin, White Masks, you know, about the colonized subject who goes to the metropole, who goes to the capital and thinks he's better.
Yeah, sure, but as you know, as soon as, for example, Ukraine will be taken by Russia, Ukraine
won't be taken by Russia.
Okay, we all hope for this, yes, but still, if
is better than when.
If Ukraine will be taken by Russia, like in 10 years, Ukrainians will become of the Russian power targeted against other European nations, and then in hundreds of years, the historians will tell you that Ukrainians became a part of Russian successes and Russian failures.
But I don't think that's the story of the 1940s, 1950s in the Soviet Union. I think Ukrainians are part of the story of the great defeat of the Nazis. And it was a great defeat. And Hitler wasn't a little boy compared to... By the way, I want to go back to bashing Western Europe soon. You know, can't we... this class is going to be about how bad France and Belgium and Germany are, and we can get back to how bad you guys have been later. But Victor... and how bad the Russians are.
Just to follow up on the slippery slope of this post-war memory and identity policies, since you a couple times mentioned that Soviet Union defeated the Nazi Germany, but it was a global ally effort in Second World War, so it's not only the Soviet Union, which is proves us good marketing of memory policy done by Soviet Union.
No, in America, we think we defeated the Nazis.
No, but globally, this is...
No, it's only something one would say, yeah.
But
in this part of the world.
In Europe especially,
No, not true. Every World War II movie produced by Hollywood, there are no Soviets in them.
But the sentiment in Germany towards Russian, what Soviet Union did with memory policy, especially in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, it's how they promoted through academia, through propaganda, through other channels, some stereotypes, and they provoked some attitudes towards modern Russia.
I think that's something, Victor, I think that's something slightly different, which is that the Russians convinced the Germans, because they probably controlled a certain chancellor, who I won't mention, they convinced the Germans that the Russians were the ones, the Slavs, the Nazis meant. When that's not true. They meant all of them, and the Ukrainians were specifically targets of Nazi ideology. So that's a particular thing. But I come from a country where, because of the Cold War, nobody mentioned the Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazi Germany. You know, no Ukrainian generals, no Russian generals, none of those people even appear in World War II movies. World War II movies are just the Americans defeating the Nazis. So in my country, there is no, no mention, it's always we defeated the Nazis and then we defeated the Soviet Union.
My question is about the marketing of academic research and the marketing of different policies, especially memory policies, because you see here in the audience
your question is about specifically Germany.
No, even here in the audience, we have different perspectives of how to explain, and it's based on, different people read different books. So this is about how this information is set, about how it's, sold to us as a customers via different channels. So my question to you is, how do you assess this marketing strategies of research, of academia, like as we speaking now about Second World War? So do you see or feel any differences? What is sold in America and what is sold here in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, so in America specifically, our World War II movies don't have any black soldiers in them. It's just white soldiers, right? There were a lot of black soldiers who fought in World War II, but I'm not aware of any World War II movie in America that shows any black people. So it's all about how white Americans defeated Hitler. We fought Hitler with a segregated army. So that's one thing about the marketing related to our topic of racism and colonialism. And number two, there are no Soviets in World War II movies. Our narrative, and the one we're taught, is that the Americans defeated the Soviet Union, the Nazis, and then the Americans defeated the Soviet Union. So the very idea, it's very moving to me as an American to go up on that hill and see the World War II memorial, because for us, it's not something we ever talk about. The Nazis and the Soviets were both equally bad, and they were the empires that we defeated, when that narrative is not true. And I think, memory politics is the underlying theme of this course, right? Because Adam Hochschild's book is about how no one remember, and Cesare tells us this, everyone's like I come here and you're all like, we want to be European. I'm like, who wants to be European? Europe has committed these horrific crimes. Now I agree, Russia has committed horrific crimes, Ukraine has committed horrific crimes, everybody's committed horrific crimes. So that's just what it means to be a country. Alexander was talking about this yesterday. He's like, what are you talking about? You know, I was sort of leaning in, and Alexander corrected. He's like, we've been imperialist. So yeah, I mean, I think memory politics, the only kind, and we've been talking about healthy nationalism versus bad nationalism. I think the story there is a correct memory politics. Like, a healthy nationalism involves, has to begin with, here's the stuff we did wrong. And that's extremely hard to do, very, very hard to do. The country that's the best at it has been Germany, but as you're raising, Germany has screwed it up because they've fallen into a kind of Russian trap about memory politics. And it's not just that. Germans have a narrative in their history that absolves them. So I know you guys want to talk about Russia, but can I just attack the Germans for a little? Is that okay? You guys just do not hate the Germans enough. It's very disturbing. So, right, I mean, I'm sorry, I shouldn't make these jokes. But, right. Collect the war crimes, yeah. No, I mean, I think one of the reasons I'm here is because the version of Ukrainian nationalism post-Maidan seems promising to me. You know, Maidan was, seems, you're like, well, I'm not going to be too, all nationalism is problematic. Any nationalism is problematic. And I'm never going to be, fully down with any version of nationalism. But yeah, Ukraine is facing its past, and Ukraine is, when I'm telling you about the Lvov pogroms in World War II, it's something people know about here. So thank you for that, yeah. But let me bash Germany. Can I attack Germany again? Say something critical about Germany's memory politics. I went to high school in Germany, and we learned that, we were told the Holocaust was Auschwitz, and the camps were run by the SS, and the SS weren't really Germans, they were these horrible monsters, And then the people who did all the killing were Slavs, Ukrainians and Russians, and Slavs. And the ordinary Germans didn't know about Auschwitz. So I was taught that the Holocaust was Auschwitz, ordinary Germans didn't do it, and didn't know about it. Well, if the Holocaust was Auschwitz, ordinary Germans didn't do it, didn't know about it, and ordinary Germans didn't do it. So then Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Germans, came out. And so for me, it was always very confusing because, as I've told you, only my mother and her sister are the only survivors of their family. All 6 of their aunts and uncles were killed, and every single one of their kids. But none of them made it to concentration camps. They're all shot over pits by the Wehrmacht. But that Holocaust by bullets, just like Holodomor, was not a concept until 2010, 2011. And the ordinary Germans were in the Wehrmacht. They were the ones who shot people. You had a question.
Yes, I would really like to turn to Iran reading. And
good.
Yes. It is in the fashion of many to treat racism and its fruits as a highly contagious notion. So many of our nations quote found themselves caught up in, and this is the statement I strongly agree with. And in the chapter 6 of her work, Karen argues that actually race thinking before shifting its political essence actually was a key phenomena for many scholars to conceptualize their ideas around. And so my question would be, at what point of history or the development of societies as such did the political elite start viewing racism as radical version of race thinking to create their political campaigns with? What were the prerequisites of this process?
What were they what? Thank you for turning us to a rant.
So what were the prerequisites of this? When did they start viewing racism as their tool for their campaigns?
Well, great. What's your name?
Daria.
What?
Daria.
Okay, I'm going to work on name. Sorry about that. Great question. So let's go back. Let's start discussion of race thinking before racism, of the second chapter of imperialism. Arendt is saying that you cannot understand European nationalism without understanding racism. So nationalism is a new construct, right? Late 18th, 19th century, and it grows up together with racism. So with race thinking, she begins with. So race thinking is central to, so when you look at Fichte's addresses to the German nation, he's not a biological racist. He's not a blood racist. But he uses the terminology of race. So he talks about the German race. But he's not thinking of that as a blood thing. He's thinking of it's linguistic nationalism. You guys also face linguistic nationalism, right? So Fichte, right, Fichte talks about how the German language is very special and all other languages are inferior. He talks about language like later German nationalists talked about race. And he uses the vocabulary of race. And Arendt is saying to understand each of these national characters, as it were, the national characters of the countries that colonized Africa, you need to understand their different versions of racism. And I wonder sometimes, I think it might be unfair to Germans, but this is why I assigned the Isabel Hull reading. Germans in the countries they colonized in Africa always perpetrated genocide. And genocide specifically against groups of people. Like the Herero would rebel and they'd kill most of the Herero. So obviously that's something the Germans continued to do. So Arendt is saying these different versions of colonization in Africa, there were different versions, and the different versions were connected with the sort of national character of the colonizing countries. Ina, is that your name? Ina asked me after class yesterday, I just want to put this out there because I'm still puzzled by it, why, when you make that comment, that there are these different national characters that result in different kinds of imperialism. You look at Belgian imperialism, and it's like the worst kind of imperialism imaginable. But then you look at Belgium as a European country, and it's like, what the hell, you guys? Like, the French fry people? I mean, I shouldn't joke about it because it's like, but how did they get away with it? And how come the imperial boomerang thesis, that's what Ina asked, how come Belgium didn't become Nazi Germany? I don't have an answer to that. But yeah, so can you do your name one more time? I really have to.
Daria.
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 Daria. Okay, that's easy. Okay, so Daria asks when race becomes a political tool. Now, race is always a political tool in the United States, and it's a political tool today. and one could think that, so I'm going to go backwards to this question. Europe right now, race is a political tool in Europe. Look at the response to like the Syrian refugee crisis. Look at the difference between the Polish response to Ukraine and the Polish response to Syria. Russians did both of those things. It's both the Russians. The Russians massacred Syrians. They killed 48,000 people in Aleppo. That's where, you know, they were practicing, right? The Syrian refugees and the Ukrainian refugees are victims of the same damn people. What's that Russian phrase I used on Instagram? But but the Poles, you know, they're not letting any Syrians in. That's race. So, you know, I spoke, Timothy Snyder, my friends Timothy Snyder and Marcy Shore, when I was in Poland in October, were like, talk about how great Poland has been with Ukrainian refugees. So I did that in a talk. And a Polish MP, member of parliament, stood up and said, how dare you come to our country and not mention Syrian refugees? And so race, you know, the European wall preventing immigration, you know, it hasn't applied to Ukrainians because of race. Obviously in America, I don't have to explain to you how much race, you know, every single election in America is about black people. Every one, you know. So how did that happen? How did that happen? When does it become a tool? Well, Arendt is saying it becomes a tool as justifying colonialism because European wealth is because of colonialism. You know, the Cotton Kingdom same is true of the United States. I mean, you can contest that, but no one contests a lot of wealth is due to colonialism. So race is, in effect, you know, race is the basis of the Enlightenment version of colonialism. But race, and here I think you need to add the element of anti-Semitism, which I didn't assign. Part one of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism is called anti-Semitism. Part two is called imperialism, and part three is called totalitarianism. And I don't think we can understand the full pieces of Europe without the anti-Semitism part. So an anti-Semitism is a big political tool in Europe. And that's, I think, to be distinguished from anti-black racism. Anti-Semitism has this structure. They're not really German. They're not really French. They're not really Ukrainian. And then that becomes, Jews are the national minorities in multiple countries, obviously in Ukraine, obviously in Poland, the two largest Jewish populations. And then that becomes central to the politics of those countries. So we're omitting part one of Origins of Totalitarianism. And that, you know, Jews are the foreign others in these countries. They're not really of the country. They're the internal enemies. And that's a non-imperialist. That's a different story than the imperialist, than the racial imperialism. The racial imperialism is this civilization-savage distinction. The Jews are theorized more like, as I've been saying, the Russians are theorizing Ukrainians, that, you know, they're this enemy other who's there just to sort of somehow subvert us and destroy us from within, with differences between the two groups. So obviously anti-Semitism is now not relevant because Hitler was largely successful. But anti-Islam, right? Anti-Islam sentiment is playing much that role in Western Europe. So the politics, to understand the politics of France, the right-wing politics that Putin is supporting, you need to understand the role of Muslims as a national minority. So that's to say that there are multiple pieces here. Racism is one piece, But when you're talking about European internal politics, you know, you have to focus on national minorities. You know, you have to focus on, I mean, you guys now have national minorities, have different national minorities. It's not Jews are not a national minority that plays a role in politics now here. Well, I suppose you're president, but he's not theorized as a member of a national minority. So national minorities play this. In America, black people are our national minority. So they play the role that they're our dominant national minority, 13%. So racism as a tool, so it's really anti-Semitism. That's the tool of right-wing politics. That was the tool of French politics and the Dreyfus Affair. It was the tool of German politics. Blackness was the tool of American politics forever. So I think there's a different question of political tool versus central to national identity. Racism, what Arendt is arguing is that racial domination is central to French national identity, British national identity, and German national identity. That they are better than black people. And that's just, that doesn't play it's not really a tool in politics, it's more like an assumption. Like, you know, we are Europe, and we deserve to take these countries and rob them and take their goods and et cetera. That's the national character, justifying colonialism. But internal to those countries, what plays the political tools, they're always directed against national minorities, right? I'm not as familiar with the internal dialectic of Ukraine. I'm not familiar at all about how the national minorities play out here. Are Russians a national minority here? Does that count? What? Yes. Okay. So there's some, right. But they seem to play the role that, say, ethnic Germans played in Poland. So the Nazis invaded Poland saying, oh, they're going to do a genocide of the ethnic Germans, or they're doing a genocide. So that's a role that there's an external role that the Russian national minority plays here.
I just want to make a comment.
Julia.
Very often when we talk about Russian minority, it gets mixed with Russian-speaking people. And
right.
That's what Russia builds on. They don't build on the Russian minority. But
Oh, you have to speak into the microphone,
sorry.
Julia.
Yeah, they build their argument on the Russian-speaking, not the Russian minority, because for Russia, everybody who speaks Russian basically is
right.
the subject of their empire.
Right. So we're going to be switching from blood conceptions of race. I mean, the reason I picked Ngugi wa Thiong'o to teach is he's talking about language. So we're going to be reading Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Start reading Decolonizing the Mind for tomorrow. We're going to continue discussing Arendt, but read Ngugi wa Thiong'o, start the reading for, and Du Bois, White Masters of the World. Du Bois really is relevant for today because he's talking about racial domination. But you guys are dealing with cultural and linguistic imperialism, and cultural and linguistic nationalism, cultural and linguistic and identity nationalism. And that's what Ngugi wa Thiong'o is going to be talking about, which is interesting because they obviously also face racial nationalism, but he's focusing on linguistic and so my response to you is that we didn't read part 1, anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semitism that is the dominant political tool of France, of political parties in France, in Germany, in Poland, in Ukraine, you know, in many of these countries. But racism is more the basis of nationalism. And then the form of racism, I think Arendt makes an error that you guys can report on, and I use Ukraine as an example in my new book of this error. era. Arendt is going to say, and even says here, that racist nationalism only becomes genocidal when it's based on blood. You guys know that's false. Ukrainians know that's false. Because you're facing a genocide, and it doesn't have to do with blood nationalism. It has to do with linguistic nationalism, right? So Arendt is going to have a thesis, and you can see why she's saying that at her time, that you only will have genocide when you have, so the elimination of another group, when you have this blood conception. But it turns out, you know, and my example in the book I'm working on is the Ukraine war, that you can have genocide that is based on a linguistic and cultural nationalism. Did I cover something? Okay. Sergey?
Since we are talking about linguistic nationalism, which is central to Ukraine, because there is a deep internal division in Ukraine, and this division engenders politics that, using the words from How Fascism Works, could be described as fascist politics. And I'm afraid nobody will be talking about this. And this is all about linguistic and cultural nationalism. It has nothing to do with race or ethnicity. And there is a chosen nation, like you say, and the peculiarity is that you are not born into the chosen nation. You can freely choose it, yes? Anybody can accept Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, and become a member of the chosen nation. But there are people who don't want to do it, who don't want to reject their identity, and those people are targeted since 2017. There are laws which contradict Ukrainian constitution that actually constitute a crime under Ukrainian Penal Code, but those laws are more and more voted for, signed into law, and enacted. So there is a problem. You were talking yesterday, very correctly, that Ukraine should not become a copy of Putin's Russia. But the problem is it is already becoming a copy of Putin's Russia in some extent. And to be more precise, it already has become a copy of Hungary, Poland, Turkey, countries like that. So there is a problem. And,
yeah, don't do that.
And since, judging by what I heard here, I think that the majority of people even here in this very intelligent audience don't want to see that problem.
Well, that's thank you for saying that. I'm here to learn, so I can't speak to, I mean, I would expect that because you're at war. So I would expect a kind of, violent nationalism. And this is why we're going to read Fanon. Fanon will, that will resonate with you. Fanon says, when you're fighting an anti-colonial war, it gets ugly. The key thing is when you win, you have to change. So some of these, but I was some people, okay, I won't mention the people this time, they were like, this is not the time to discuss this in Ukraine. But I think it is the time to discuss it in Ukraine, because if you can't discuss it now and you leave it for later, well then, the transition will be very problematic. Sophia. Okay, we'll use the microphone while you, yeah.
I was just going to say, as a response to anyone who says now is not the time to discuss it, it's condescending to assume Ukrainians can't think critically while they're also at war.
Right, exactly. Yes, it's very condescending, yeah. So, and we're discussing it, we're discussing it, because the key thing is, when Ukraine wins, what fascism always tries to do is create the very thing that it claims is happening. So as Arendt says, the Nazis said Jews are disease-ridden, Jews are and so what they did was, brutally treat Jews and then send them over the border, so you had this traumatized population that fit the stereotypes of what the Nazis were saying about the Jews. Russians are saying Ukrainians are fascists. So one way to do that is have a brutal war and have the version of Ukrainian nationalism that wins be the fascist version. So you can't let that happen. because that would actually be a victory for Russia. So it's actually part of the war. Everyone's running around whispering. Vlad, okay. Nothing's wrong, right? No, okay. So yeah, it's actually part of the war. So let's see. Okay, I've covered this. So right, so just, I want to, the first sentence right, I've been talking about how colonialism and racial colonialism, you know, the reason I'm teaching as a philosopher this course on colonialism, philosophy just deals with these universal notions, is I think colonialism is as central a concept as democracy. These are concepts that are as old as humans are. You look at, we now know, of course, that in all these areas, in all the areas conquered by European colonialism, there were giant empires. Africa had giant empires. Franz Boas, in the 1906 lecture, said that when Europe was just different tribes running around in loincloths, Boas was perhaps the greatest early anthropologist. Boas said Africa had multinational empires. The sign of civilization is having an empire that has different linguistic groups in it and different religions, and you can all live together, right? That's like the sign of cosmopolitanism, right? So Boas says in that 1906 lecture that Africans have always had empires. And even today, when you look at Africa, every single country has many, many groups in it. And the thing that and nothing like European nationalism has emerged in Africa. Maybe Tanzania is an example, but it's still very different. It's still very different. Rwanda, I don't want to go off on this, and maybe that's too general of a claim, but Boas's point was that empires, and of course indigenous Americans had large empires. So there was imperialism and colonization in the Americas. Every American knows, or every Ukrainian, even the Ukrainian Americans know that the Iroquois were a large empire that controlled a lot of the Northeast. Anyone from the United States can tell you about the giant indigenous empire that was local. I'm from upstate New York. It was the Iroquois Empire. But obviously the Aztec Empire, as everybody knows, was. So imperialism, colonialism, these are concepts central to human existence. So you wouldn't want to say imperialism is what's responsible for the modern world. But what Charles Mills, what the black intellectual tradition, there's not one black, but much of the black intellectual tradition says that to understand the modern world, or just to read the first sentence of the Racial Contract, white supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. That's the famous first sentence of the Racial Contract. So the idea is that what the Enlightenment is, what Europe is these, this is thinking of Julia's comment throughout about human rights. What the trick that Europeans did was use Enlightenment concepts as a mask for racial domination. The idea was, we're superior because we have these wonderful concepts of reason and rationality. And therefore we can grab your land, therefore we can dominate you. And it's the version of colonialism and imperialism that is racial. that makes the modern world what it is today. So that's to agree. So I'm saying with Sergei yesterday and Alexander to some degree that colonialism and imperialism occur everywhere and in every society because they're these universal concepts. We can grab your land. You're not using your land. You know, they can occur within races, but racial colonialism. That Arendt's claim is that's the European trick. That Europeans create nationalism. Nationalism brings with it a kind of racial. She's talking about Western Europe, so. It brings with it a racial thing that each of these nations is is white, and their whiteness entitles them to have parts of Africa. So that's why. So the theme of this class has been that a Central European value is racism, and it makes Europe what Europe is. So. Don't be so comfortable with saying, we're Europe, we're Europeans. And you will see that more and more because we saw with Brexit that Britain was like, oh no, we want to be our own nation, we don't want to be part of Europe, we don't want to be colonized by Europe. But what's happening in the European project is racism looks like it's actually conquering, you know, you have different racist leaders in France. You have AfD in Germany. You have Hungary and Poland. Orban, you know, Orban explicitly talks about. Orban came to the United States and said, "We don't want race mixing in Hungary." He said that in the United States. So when we let what Europe now faces is this classic ill of racism dominating the European Union. If Orban's vision wins, then, and the vision of peace and the vision of, we have white nationalism rising, AfD, so Europe might come to mean, again, what Europe has meant for so many in the world, which is racial domination. You're already seeing that with the immigrant crisis, right? The world, I can tell you that lots of people look at what Meloni is doing in Italy, what Greece is doing, and see that they're letting people die, little kids die and on the, you know, drown, rather than letting them in.
Yeah, just to go back, or just something to kind of put more focus on what you're saying about what's happening in Europe right now and connecting it to colonialism. If you look at the rhetoric of a lot of these now nationalist leaders across Europe, they're actually, in what they're saying, they want to go backwards to how things were. So for example, you know, Brexit, the main slogan of Brexit was, you know, what was it I wrote about? Yeah, take back control, right? It's like, go back to the time where we, as this great colonial nation, had the control over everyone else. Right. It's the same for America, right? Like, make America great again. It's like, let's go back to a time supremacy. When we were controlling and we were doing what we wanted to do. And it's actually very similar if you look at France and all the other sort of fascist nationalist powers right now. And I think that just shows that it's important for us to keep looking at colonialism as a central, as you said, racism and colonialism value of Europe as well, because they're openly talking about going back to a time when they had more power and control and dominated a lot of other places around the world.
And they're racial, national, right, exactly.
I just want to add on, to build on that it's also the same with Russia. Like Putin's essay of going back to Kiev and Rus that he sees as the birthplace of Russia, and his great conquest right now is basically either going back to like the USSR, because he has the famous quote where he says that like the dissolution of the USSR was the the worst thing that could happen to Russia. And I think it's very interesting how it's the same threat in Europe, in these white supremacist, nationalist, and Putin specifically, in Putin's Nazi Russia.
Putin is the leader of white supremacist nationalism in the world.
Yeah, because he supports them.
He funds all the white supremacist nationalist groups. The Russians fund Trump. The Russians fund the National Rifle Association. And the Russians fund Le Pen. The Russians fund all these far-right groups. So, you know, yeah, but right now, I want to say one thing before we go to more questions. Let's not let the Russians, when you link Russia with the Soviet Union, you're actually playing into their hands, because the Soviet Union is very popular in lots of countries that suffered from American imperialism. Latin America, you can't, I've said this before, we did to Latin America what the Soviet Union did to lots of countries. Every time there was a democracy, we toppled it and put a dictatorship. You know, Chile, I mean, they dropped suspected communists from helicopters. You know, so in those countries, the Soviet Union was popular. Let's not connect Russia with the Soviet Union, thereby making Russia popular. And that's what's happening right now. That's what's, when you guys say Russia is the Soviet Union, you think that everyone will recoil in horror. That's not true. You know, and Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is, look at what's happening in Africa right now. What's happening in Africa is Wagner and Russia are toppling democracy after democracy and replacing them with autocrats. So Russia is doing terrible things to the global south under the guise of saying, see, we're just like the Soviet Union was. Just like the United States was great in Eastern Europe and terrible in Latin America, Soviet Union was not so bad in Latin America. So, but right now what Russia is doing is they're just going after every democracy and trying to undermine them. They're doing that in the global south too.
Yeah, I have just a comment and maybe a question to you regarding to this discussion. Now I'm living in Austria, and I talk a lot with German-speaking people about this situation in Ukraine, and just want to share my experience that people in Germany, in Austria in particular, I can't tell about other countries, European, they are ready, really ready to help and to care about refugees, Syrian refugees, Ukrainian refugees, but they absolutely can't discuss the action of aggression. So they can discuss the victims, but they are not able to discuss the actions of aggressor. And for them, it's really very difficult to discuss the actions of Russians in this war, and so on and so on. From the other side, we are really criticize the action of German government, who are very slowly in their in their decisions about weapon supply, about some decision about sanctions against Russia, and so on and so on. And
yeah, Timothy Snyder, obviously.
Yeah. So there is some kind of blind spot in this thinking of Western society about the.
That's just Germany.
Germany.
Yeah. I mean, specifically Germany.
It's specifically Germany, right. Really.
And Gerhard Schroeder has some fault here, because Gerhard Schroeder, who then worked for Gazprom.
and one of the idea why we are like facing this behavior, this idea, they feel really some confusion about their identification. If we project our current situation into the Second World War situation, we see the shifting of the role. The Russia, who was like a Soviet Union and who was a victim.
So can I tell you what I say to German audiences? I say, you're the same thing I was saying to you guys. The same thing I said. What is your name? Okay, I'll have to work. Okay, yeah. So the same thing I was saying to her, and or the provocation. This was the provocation. What I say in Germany is, Russians are fascists. You should be against fascism. I understand that, you were the fascists.
Yeah,
And
the next question they face, who we are, Germans, in this situation.
Right.
And it's difficult
Germans,
with its own identification.
Germans should be anti-fascists. And so hence they should be against what Russia is doing and against Russia. That's what I say when I'm in Germany. And all of you guys think in terms of the people, the nations, and not in terms of the political ideologies. And that's an error. That's my provocation. That's a mistake. Stop thinking about national identity and start thinking about the political ideologies. The enemy is fascism. If Israel is fascist, they're the enemy. It doesn't matter that they're Jewish.
Yeah, but ordinary people, so-called, can't understand it really. So it's impossible for them to realize the situation.
Well, that's why you have intellectuals. But I think ordinary people can understand fascism. They can understand, the important thing to understand is the victims of an ideology. And this was Sergei's point about the worries about Ukrainian nationalism. The victims of an ideology can embrace that ideology later, justifying their embracing of that ideology as we were victims. And so the Germans, what I say when I'm in Germany is, you're anti-fascists, and that's a fascist country right now. So, Putin's doing this thing saying, I can't be a fascist because we're the victims of fascism. Israel does that too. So let's not let that happen. Let's focus on the ideologies. Germany's commitment is to liberalism and anti-fascism. So they should be on Ukraine's side. And as long as Ukraine is defending things like replacing its leaders by elections, transparency, tolerance, everybody who defends those concepts should be on their side. Stop thinking, the whole point is, let's stop thinking in terms of nationalities. It helps to realize that nationalism was invented yesterday. So everyone's like, I am this, but that's new. But political ideologies are old. You're right about Germany, but it's the same error that was my provocation. My provocation was, let's think in terms of ideologies. Russia is not the Soviet Union, no matter what Putin says. Russia is a fascist country that is promoting Russian nationalism, and they're promoting fascism. That's why they're toppling every democracy. And that's why they're having a coup in every, that's why Africa just had a bunch of coups sponsored by Russia. Okay, you haven't spoken yet? Yeah.
So I have a question. You're told that we shouldn't look at nations. We should look at regimes, political regimes, and then try to tackle it if it's fascist, etc. But I have a question. We can look at France and its colonial history. And France being a monarchy, being a constitutional monarchy, being a couple times of republic, being an empire, right. But still they did the same stuff regarding the Africa, regarding the Asia. Is there still now being modern liberal democracy? They're still doing the same stuff.
Right.
And someone in the auditory also talked about Russia, that Russia's also been in different regimes and different types regarding to Ukraine, but it still went for centuries to perform some oppression, to try to tackle their identity or getting resources from the territories. So you said that tackling their regimes is the answer, but is it really an answer?
Oh, good. Great point. What's your name?
Andre.
Andre?
Andre, yep.
Andre?
Andre is fine, yeah.
Okay,
nice.
Sorry.
It's okay.
All right. I'm going to, okay. So, yeah, I think I'm running into a conflict. I think you're pointing out a tension in the positions I've taken in the last 2 hours. Because what Arendt is saying is that nationalism, this new development in late 18th, 19th century, brings with it a kind of character that justifies a form of colonialism. So, so French, I don't think, I don't think when people are like centuries and centuries, that's not true because nationalism is new. So that different countries have been imperialist. Imperialism is universal. It's something that, every single society, I mean, I don't know if this is true, but most societies throughout human history have had imperialist empires that dominate and control other groups. Certainly indigenous Americans, certainly Africa. Europe was kind of even, if Boaz is right, they came even later than Africa to colonial empires. So can't quite be right because of Athens. Well, I think he meant Northern Europe. Arendt is saying there's a kind of character to colonialism, and this is your point, that comes, that is related to the version of nationalism that people have. And that might go through different, you might have a French nationalist empire under Napoleon, and that's going to dominate Haiti in a certain way, under a monarchy, and it's going to continue once France becomes a republic. So that's a fair point. That's in tension with what I'm saying about political systems. But maybe in defense of me, maybe the thing to say is, look, the political system is colonial domination under a form justified by racism. And that's a political structure. Colonial domination justified by racism is a political structure, and Arendt is saying it's a new political structure. It comes with the Enlightenment. Like, the function of concept of European values was to justify racist imperial domination. So that is a kind of political structure. And it can survive, it can go through monarchy, republic. So I guess that would be the defense of me. But thank you for seeing a tension. There was, go on.
Thank you so much for this fruitful discussion. I have a short comment and I want to ask a short question. First of all, I have a short comment about this equation, Soviet Union, Russia, and Russian Empire. I think there are two levels of discussion. First is happening within the Ukrainian society, and the second is for the whole world. I completely agree with your point that our attempt to communicate the evil nature of Soviet crimes, probably it wouldn't work for Latin American countries or for Africa. But for Ukrainians, it's another level of discussion because we just received a chance to reflect on the trauma which was committed by the Communist Party or Soviet officials relatively recently. We just started this at the level of memory politics in 2015, yes. So for us, it's two different levels of communication. And I think it should be processed with the Ukrainian society in order to move forward. But probably it's not the best strategy for communication abroad. Yeah. And the second question is kind of connected to this reflection.
Also, many Ukrainians were communists, so.
Yes, but what Ukrainians are trying to do while reflecting on this trauma, they're trying to say that decisions were made in Moscow, no matter by whom they were made, by people of Ukrainian origin, Georgian origin.
Helpful, yeah.
Yes, so for us, this is we were coordinated from Moscow. We didn't have this level of agency.
That's helpful.
And you repeated a few times today that we are facing the same Nazism today as it was in Nazi Germany. So I was wondering, when do you start to see Russia as a Nazi country? Because what also Ukrainians are trying to say, that it didn't start in 2022. It started much earlier, and we provide like a lot of examples and references in the past. So when do you start to see Russia as a Nazi regime?
So I'm not an Eastern Europeanist, as I say. So I get stuff from my colleagues who are Eastern Europeanists, like Timothy Snyder and Marcy Shore. I get this from The Road to Unfreedom, Snyder's book, where he says, where he points out that Putin had a Russian fascist, I forget, Ivan
Ilyin.
Who?
Ivan Ilyin.
Yeah, taken and reburied in Moscow, you know, which is kind of a hint that, and you have this Russian, there's very clear, you know, white Russian nationalism in Russia, dating, I think, back, you know, 15 years, 10, you know, I'm not sure. I'm not a scholar of this. I get it from my colleagues, but this kind of aggressive Russian nationalism, I can't say if Putin brought it. I just don't know enough about. But it's very clear now that there's a genocidal Russian nationalism that, you know, we've been talking about bad nationalism. It's very clear that you guys face explicit bad nationalism. It's also very clear that the Soviet Union, that was not the Soviet Union's ideology. Soviet Union, you were not facing bad nationalism, you were facing totalitarian communism, which is a different bad thing. There can be different bad things in the world. But totalitarian communism is not the same as, you know, a kind of Nazi fascism. And right now, the ideology you face is, you know, Russian domination, you know, which is just not, you know, even though you said it's coordinated from Moscow, it wasn't the official ideology. So all the running together, my provocations have been like, stop running the stuff together. It's fascism you face as an ideology. It's Russian, based on Russian bad nationalism. Don't become the fascists, don't become Ukrainian fascists in response. You know, be careful about that. Then you're actually giving the Russians their victory. You're looking at me. Okay, what? What time is it? Oh, 12:06. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. See you guys tomorrow.